Canola oil is one of the healthiest cooking oils. When the canola seed arrives at the processing factory, it contains foreign material, mostly plant pieces. The seeds pass by a magnet. It removes any metal that may have fallen in during the journey from field to factory.
What are you eating right now? Are you eating self-hatred? Well, we're glad to have our friend Brad Marshall returning to our program on the seed oil survival series that we do. I'm David Gornoski, and Brad, how you doing? You doing well?
I'm doing well. Yep.
Yeah.
It's a gray day here in upstate New York in
Yeah.
April, but we got some sun this week, so I'll
You
have to
had
live with it.
you had some eclipse this week too, didn't you, up there, huh?
We did. We did. We had
Did you
a
get to
we had
see
a
it?
total eclipse. My parents' house was right on the zone of totality. I'm just south of it here in Ithaca, but so we went up there and yeah, we saw the real thing. Except it was actually we had 3 days of almost total sun, and then we had 2 hours of dense cloud cover, which is exactly when the eclipse happened. So um, the cloud timing was exactly wrong, but it was still pretty cool.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to talk to you today to kind of get an update on your experiments with what you call the emergence diet, which we can do a quick refresher of. And I want to contrast it today throughout the discussion with kind of some of the other paradigms that people are using to try to deal with PUFA toxicity or what have you. Um, some people are still in denial that seed oils are a problem. We can get into that a little bit, but I think most of the people on this show understand the evidence is pretty strong that they are a problem. I had a person comment the other day when they found out a new study showing massive levels of cadmium and lead in the Lunchables for children. And he
Mm,
said, "Oh, come on. There's nothing wrong with our food. It's fine. It's just people don't want to cut their calories and get on with it."
yeah,
And I said, yeah, cadmium and lead's perfectly fine to be
yeah,
in
it's fine. Don't worry
children's
about it.
foods. Yeah. Yeah, that's called the ostrich. That's the ostrich syndrome right there, right? Keeping your head in the sand, huh?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean it is yeah, between that and the plastic contamination too, the
Oh my
is big.
goodness.
Is the BPA, the BPB,
Yeah.
everything's BPA free now, but it's also full of BPB, which just hasn't really gotten the publicity. So plastic contamination is another huge endocrine disruptor that we deal with. Remember that train of vinyl. I think it was about this time last year that blew up in Ohio, and it burned. They burned it on purpose,
Yeah.
and it was carrying vinyl, and it unleashed this enormous cloud of like probably these kind of these crazy
Yeah.
vinyl based compounds that probably spread throughout the air of the East Coast. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we're dealing with, right? And so then if your diet is also wrong, you're just compounding the modern troubles that we have, right?
Yeah. What do you think? How do you break down the level of impact of these various factors? When you talk about endocrine disruptive plastics in the food, I mean, everybody's getting their meat and everything wrapped in plastic and,
Yeah, I
I
mean
mean,
I don't know if you saw this study, but it was like 95% of Americans have detectable levels of microplastics in their bloodstream. Um, I mean, it's hard to know, how you, um, right? It's hard to give it a percentage. It's like what
yeah,
percentage of the problems are from plastics
yeah,
versus what percentage are from, polyunsaturated fats versus,
yeah.
yeah, cadmium and lead. I mean, how do you know? But it's all there. Mercury and seafood. Um, I like seafood, but you're always getting a little bit of mercury with it. So it's it's hard to kind of handicap it all though, right?
Yeah. And there's mercury even in shellfish too. Is that right?
There's some. There's a lot. I think there's less in shellfish than there are. It's the larger predatory fish that
Yeah.
kind of bioaccumulate it the most.
Yeah.
Especially the long-lived ones. Things like shark and swordfish are really very, very high.
Yeah.
You
It's
probably don't
probably
want
one
to
of the
eat
worst
those.
things you can eat is shark on a stick at the fair. You know, have you ever seen those?
Yeah,
It's battered
yeah,
and
they are
it's
definite.
battered and it's got batter which is probably laced with Roundup and you know this nasty flour, and it's fried in the most rancid form of seed oils known to man, the fair oil fryers, and then it's got loads of mercury in the meat.
It's probably true.
God.
uh, especially if they wrap it in plastic for you.
Yeah, right. So you've been on the emergence diet, so you're trying to emerge out of the state of torpor, right? That's where you came up with that
Yes.
term. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the idea.
It's
And
spring, so you shouldn't be in torpor, right? You should be
right. Well,
alive.
we should be. This is about the time when we should be emerging from our torpor.
Do you feel better?
I do. I do. I mean, it's been a weird. My father passed away. I think I mentioned this to you in the beginning of March.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of getting. And I was with my family for a couple weeks, and I love them. But every time I go stay with my family for 2 weeks, everyone's always cooking and in the kitchen, and I inevitably put on 10 pounds. So, but I've lost that weight again. So I'm back to moving down to new low weights. So
yeah, you look great.
Yeah, I'm hoping to shed another 20 or 30 pounds by 4th of July. That's my goal.
Yeah, to be independent, right? And then you'll be free.
That's right.
Do you think once you get to that goal or whatever you're looking for, weight loss wise, how long will you stay on the emergence diet, or will you start to tweak it when you get to your goal weight?
I mean, I'll probably tweak it a bit and add in some more. So right now, what I'm doing, the emergence diet, the concept is actually very low in protein. And so that freaks some people out because everybody says you should get more protein, get more protein, get more protein. And I was saying to you last night on that text thread, what's interesting is, when you look at the three macros, protein, fat, and carbohydrate, if you cut any one of the three out, right, people tend to lose weight. So, or a lot of people are familiar with keto, where you remove carbohydrates. That can help people. And then, very low fat diets have been shown to work in the past in a lot of different contexts. And we know this works really well in lab mice. But then the other thing you can do is you can really cut back on protein. And that also seems to work. And so I think that,
now, wouldn't the normie response be, well, yeah, all three of them are working if you cut one macro out dramatically because you're in effect just doing a low calorie diet. So it's all goes back to calories there. Or what would you say to that?
Well, that's what they think. But I will guarantee you that if I eat if I just eat a normal, so if left to my own devices, I will eat something like, I'll just have toast and eggs, like butter and toast and eggs for breakfast, and like a sandwich at lunch, and just kind of a regular, I would eat rice and broccoli and a piece of steak, right? And I'm 100% certain that I will remain fat on that diet forever. Yeah. Right. And it's not a terribly high calorie diet. Although I do like to make French fries, but once a week. And so
you still do French fries on the emergence, you're saying, or you're talking about before this? Yeah.
I'm talking about in my sort of normal world, but and so I don't think I don't think I've really reduced calories on the emergence diet, but I am losing weight.
How many calories do you think you're taking in a day on the average?
Around 3,000.
Yeah. Which is higher than what people usually say when you're doing a low calorie. What's a low calorie?
Right. When people when you look at the literature, a calorie restricted diet, they're usually talking, less than 2,000, like 1,800 calories. Sometimes they're like 1,400 calories. Yeah. And for an adult male, that's a really low number.
Yeah.
And so, and if you look at metabolic studies, I remember, the guy who wrote the book Burn, talking about, he was saying that a sort of normal adult male, average size should burn around 3,000 calories a day, when you look at metabolic science. And so that's kind of about where we should be. But in my experience, if I do 3,000 calories, like I say, in a very mixed diet with all three macros, I will stay fat. But yet if I've lost weight in the past with keto, and now I'm losing weight with the protein restriction.
And you're
and
restricting
so
fat too, right? With this protein restriction.
I am, although I've been less strict about that recently. It's still pretty low fat, but I'm now at maybe like more like 20 to 30. Before I was trying to do like 10% of calories as fat. Now I'm sticking with the low protein, and I'm maybe doing 20 to 25% as fat, something like that. I'm trying to stay below 30, but
yeah.
And that helps just with, palatability and kind of ease of food. It's easier to cook with butter than not with butter. If you're trying to, saute some onions or something.
And that's not making a difference in any way, the way you feel, or the way your blood sugar, or the way you're.
I don't think so. And I mostly use butter, and I mostly use cream, and that is because, when you look at insulin sensitivity, right? So the idea of this diet is it's an insulin sensitizing diet.
Mm-hmm.
And when animals emerge from their winter torpor, they become much more insulin sensitive. So that's what I'm shooting for. And if you look at the saturated fats like butter, when people eat them, they kind of get out of the way and allow the carbohydrates to burn. If you eat the unsaturated fats, they're kind of rude, and they like to jump in line and get burned first. And the problem with that is, if you're not burning those carbohydrates because you're eating unsaturated fats and those fats are burning, then you're gonna make fat out of those carbohydrates, right? And I'm not trying to do that, and so therefore, I'm trying to eat as saturated fat as possible with the carbs and produce a lot of it. You want to produce, what you want to do really is you want to produce a lot of insulin when you eat, so that you can turn on, in this paradigm anyways, and we talk about different diets, but you want to turn on that glucose burning, and you actually want to oxidize. You want to burn that glucose for calories rather than turning it into fat, of course, or rather than doing something like glycolysis, where you're converting it all into like lactate and lactic acid. You just want it to burn cleanly. And so to do that, I think the best way to do that is to eat a meal that's a pretty large meal, that has a lot of starch in it.
And then that's breakfast time you're doing?
Yeah, that's I mean, for me, that's the easiest time. I get up and I do pancakes, or lately I've been doing I have this new this Brazilian cassava product that I love.
Do you have a picture of it or a bag of it you can show us, or is it?
Yeah, so this is the you can see it's called what is it, Julia?
Yeah.
Julia brand, and it's called toasted cassava flour, or roasted. And this one is kind of a light brown color. You can probably see it there. They also have a blanco, or a white, that I like really well. And so, as you know, David, I've been playing around with different types of cassava, because cassava is like the fourth most commonly consumed staple crop in the world, after corn, rice, and wheat. And so, but it comes in all different shapes and sizes, and this one is my favorite, this Brazilian toasted cassava flour, because it's a little more granular. Cassava flour can be kind of sticky. I don't know the right way to describe the texture, but like if you've ever had boba tea, boba tea has those pearls, those tapioca pearls. Tapioca is made from cassava starch. So it has that kind of sticky, stretchy quality that I don't love, but this toasted cassava is ground, and then they press the water out of it, and then they toast it. So it's kind of it's granulated. It actually reminds me of cream of wheat. So the way I've been eating most of it is I just put a little bit in a bowl with water, and I pop it in the microwave, and I eat it with a little bit of maple syrup and a little bit of cream, and it's almost exactly like a bowl of cream of wheat.
Is there a reason why you do maple syrup for this diet instead of like honey or cane sugar or something else, regular table sugar?
I mean, partially I really like maple syrup.
Mhm.
Partially, it's because I'm from New York and this is maple syrup country. So
Yeah,
I have my I
yeah,
have my my bottle of genuine New York State maple syrup. I have friends who make maple syrup, so it's kind of it's a regional delicacy.
yeah.
It's also maple syrup is also very high in manganese, which we need for our antioxidant status and other good things. So yeah, I really like maple syrup. Um, it's of course been made since it's been made in upstate New York for like, well, we don't know, thousands of years, presumably.
Yeah.
Well before
So,
Europeans were here.
so it wouldn't affect
Um,
your diet of what you're trying to control factor wise if you had replaced it with table sugar or honey or
I
some.
mean, I think it would still be fine. I think it would
Yeah,
still be fine.
yeah.
For me, it's mostly a personal preference, I think.
Do
Um,
you eat fruit a lot on this diet, or you don't eat that kind of stuff?
I do. I eat fruit. I use fruit as a snack. I'll have an apple if I'm just a little peckish,
Yeah,
but mostly I try to stick with starch.
yeah.
And
And
so,
mostly
I've
that
been doing the
starch is cassava, right? And,
right. So cassava is the reason for the cassava is pretty much the purest natural form of starch. It's like, when you look at cassava flour, it's like 90% starch. It's got like 3% protein. It's got a little bit of fiber. I don't even think it has 1% fat. It is as pure a natural form of starch that exists um, in the world. And so I've been starting with that because my goal is to um, get the day right, get my metabolism going first thing in the morning. And um,
and you put
I just
gelatin in
did
your
a
pancakes too, right?
what's
You
that?
do, you eat a lot of gelatin on this diet too, which is a kind of
Right. Yeah, right. And so that's the other part of this is to get connective tissues, gelatin. And I sometimes will also supplement with glycine, which is an amino acid that collagen is made out of. So, collagen is this ancient protein. We were probably we you know I'm an evolutionist, as you know, so I think a lot about evolution. But the first kind of animals that looked like us, animals that had skeletal muscles, they were eating a lot of things like jellyfish in the ocean, and jellyfish is made of collagen. So I think that animals were probably the first kind of connective protein that existed that was being eaten by things was probably collagen.
Have you ever
Um,
had jellyfish salad at the Chinese store?
I've had it once or
It's
twice.
very good.
They
Yeah.
Yeah, they have the jellyfish here at there's a new Asian store in Ithaca, and they've
Yeah.
got a whole section of jellyfish. And I look at it and I think about it, but I haven't gone there yet. I do
As
pork
a real
rinds.
item at the restaurant, they have it there, or it's like canned jellyfish. No.
It's like in these like silver bags or
Oh, okay.
pouches.
Oh,
I haven't.
yeah.
They're not
Oh,
refrigerated,
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
but they're not. It's some kind of, I don't know. I haven't.
I had jellyfish salad the first time in Atlanta. It was very delicious and I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Refreshing.
It's good.
It's probably got lots of collagen in it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's all collagen. I mean, it's mostly collagen. I mean, the water, but yeah, right. But so that's the kind of thing, like I say, I do gelatin, or I'll
Do you
do
use beef
collagen.
gelatin or any other type of gelatin?
I mean, I do it all. I do pork rinds, I do pig's feet, I do beef tendon. Beef tendon is really good.
Mhm.
It's you get it at the Asian store, and it's kind of funky looking,
Yeah.
but you
Yeah.
just simmer it for like 3 or 4 hours, and it slowly gets tender, and you can slice it up. I eat it with kind of like pasta. I've been doing some gluten-free gnocchi that are pretty low in protein, so I do those with the pasta sauce and the beef tendon. That's a fantastic kind of dinner
Yeah.
dish that I've been doing. I do I've been doing noodles, right? So that's a good one. So you take bone broth. There's different kinds of gluten-free noodles. We've talked before about glass noodles. And there's a couple others that you can find on Amazon that are low in protein. And so, I'll simmer the noodles and then I add them to bone broth, and I have different ramen seasonings that I add to it. And just, that's another really simple. I do like to cook, as we've talked about, but, I don't always like to spend a lot of time on it. So just a simple ramen noodle with the right noodles is good. And people,
So you don't eat traditional ramen noodles. You would get the glass noodles and then make it in a ramen style.
yeah, and that's mostly just, like I say, I'm trying to keep the branched chain amino acids as low as possible. Those are the specific amino acids that are in muscle meats and in grains, are high in branched chain amino acids, and they seem to be directly linked to the insulin resistance. And so, and I just did a video on this on my Fire in a Bottle YouTube channel, talking about how when you stimulate insulin, it actually lowers branched chain amino acids after the meal.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying, when I have one of these meals, to get as good as possible at burning glucose, right? And if you're overweight, you're probably not good at burning glucose, right? This is the problem. And so I'm trying to figure out how to get better at that. And so, one of the ways to do it is to essentially avoiding all unsaturated fats. And another way to do it seems to be to reduce these branched chain amino acids. And so, like, the glass noodles are made purely of like sweet potato starch or mung bean starch. They have literally zero protein in them. So, but then you're getting amino acids in the bone broth, but it's more glycine based. And to me, it's a better, if you're struggling, there are benefits to branched chain amino acids, and I always like to point that out. Some people do really well with branched chain amino acids. I find that I don't. I think once I eliminated the branched chain amino acids, that's when my blood sugar normalized. So I think for me personally, I don't deal with them that well. So I've been, sticking to more of the things like the glass noodles and the cassava and other very kind of low branched chain amino acid sources of protein. Potatoes are pretty good. They're lower than a lot of the other grains out there. They're somewhere in the middle, but that's another. I've been doing a lot of potatoes.
Yeah. Potatoes don't have a lot of BCAAs in them.
They have more than cassava or glass noodles or something like that, but they're a little bit lower than rice or wheat or corn, things like that.
Does fermenting wheat or sprouting it do anything to reduce the branched chain amino acids, or no?
I don't think so. That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that. I don't know is the answer.
What about some
Probably
of those other?
not.
What about some of those other wheats, those other grains?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of grains. Well, a lot of the grains are actually higher.
Grains.
So grains tend to be pretty high in protein. I think people don't realize.
Yeah.
I think people sort of don't realize how much protein that you get in grain-based foods. Like I was looking, there's an old study and it's they looked at these two African cultures. They were in Nigeria, two African tribes, and one of them was eating, cassava and I think plantains, and they were eating, whatever meat that they could get, but it wasn't a meat heavy diet at all. And then there was another group that was eating sorghum, I believe. I think it was red sorghum, and the group that was eating the sorghum instead of the more root vegetables, their protein content of their diet was at least double of the people eating the kind of root vegetables. And so you can get pretty, it's not hard to get 100 grams of protein from grain in a day if you're doing a high starch diet, and that's quite a bit more than you need. Like my goal is to stay under 50 for the day, or even below.
You're saying 50 grams of protein?
Well, really what I mean is what I said in the original diet spec was like 35 grams of protein that is high in branched chain amino acids. So that means like muscle meats, grain proteins, or like protein from potatoes. Keep that below about 35 grams a day. And then the protein that you get from sources like collagen and gelatin and glycine don't really count. So you can sort of have a lot more of those. That's fine. So I probably I probably wind up getting twice that much. I probably wind up getting 70 grams of protein a day, but half of it is from collagen. And I think that's a really good ratio. If you can get half your protein from collagen sources, I think you're doing fine. But it's a lot easier to get that with something like bone broth, even bone broth and potatoes.
Is it about the ratio, or is it about the actual mass? Like, can you do
It's
60 grams of protein that are BCAAs and 60 that are the gelatin type?
I think it's a little bit of both. So like we know specific ways that the branched chain amino acids and glycine, right? So the glycine, again, is in the connective tissues and the collagen, and the branched chain amino acids are in the grains and the muscle meats. They actually kind of directly, fight against each other. So if you look at people who are obese, they tend to have high circulating levels of branched chain amino acids and low levels of glycine if you look in their blood, right? And in a rat model, they gave these rats a branched chain amino acid limited diet, and the glycine actually went up. And so it seems like the two things are correlated somehow. And what the glycine does is it actually helps you pull extra kind of unburnt fuel out of your muscle tissues. And this is what they showed in these rats, is that the amount of, you get this buildup, if you're not burning your fuel cleanly, you get this burnt up kind of unburned fats in your mitochondria, in your skeletal muscle tissue. And the glycine actually goes in and it gets conjugated to these unburned fats, and you end up just urinating it out. But these are called acyl glycines. And they showed in this mouse model that if you limit the branched chain amino acids, then glycine goes up, and you eliminate these acyl glycines, and your metabolism works better. And so so part of it is about ratio, but I also think that inevitably, if you consume too many branched chain amino acids in a meal, you're going to have those elevated branched chain amino acids postprandially or after you've eaten. And I think those definitely cause problems, if you're trying to burn glucose, if that's your goal, right? In my case, my goal is to become a better glucose burner. And so, that's my reason that I'm restricting the branched chain amino acids, where, if people are on a keto diet, maybe they're not trying to burn glucose, but if you are, I wouldn't, I think combining the two. Another thing that I mentioned recently is, when I talk about this, one of the questions I get all the time is, well, okay, I want to become better burning glucose. So what I think I'll do is I'll keep eating steak, but I'll have a baked potato with the steak, right? And I tell them I don't actually think that's a great idea, and the reason is that the branched chain amino acids in the steak are going to make you relatively insulin resistant, and so you're not going to be able to utilize the starch from that potato. What I would tell people is, if you want to get better burning glucose, maybe have potato, and you want to keep eating steak, maybe have potatoes for breakfast and steak for dinner. You know what I mean? And separate them that way. And what people do point out is there's not a lot of natural foods that contain all three macros, right? They usually are like, it's like, obviously, if you kill an animal, you're going to get fat and protein. You're not going to get a lot of carbohydrates. If you find fruit, you're going to get sugar, but you're not going to really get protein. And, unless it's an avocado, you're not going to get a lot of fat. Or if you, dig up tubers, they're mostly starch with not a lot of protein in there. There are a few things that contain all three, but it's pretty rare. All right. Even acorns, acorns have carbohydrates and fat, but they're pretty low in protein. They're only like I don't know, 5 or 6% protein. So, yeah, it's
What is
pretty
it
rare
about
to
humans
find.
that we want to combine foods in such a way to max out the macros of all three?
Right. And
Steak
that,
with
and that,
eggs with potatoes and butter. It's got all of it
right.
in there,
Yeah.
right?
And that worked. That worked as long as we were all consuming saturated fat, right? But then we switched the fats, and like we said before, and then we have all these modern issues that people didn't used to have, things like plastic contamination and the BPA, and these different endocrine disruptors. Like you mentioned, the Roundup. We talked about mercury toxicity and seafood, and so
Wi-Fi and cellular towers, right?
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, all kinds of things, and so I think we've become less robust in maybe dealing with some of these subtle issues around, we went from butter to these unsaturated oils, and things didn't didn't immediately kind of explode, right? It sort of took a while, and so people maybe didn't initially see that. They started eating oils, and all of a sudden everybody became sick. It happened more slowly than that, right? And
I
so
think that had a lot to do with probably the genetics, right? The epigenetics, the expressions through decades of poisoning, right?
yeah, I mean, I think it all adds up. I think it all adds up. And
Would you be horrified if we were to snap our fingers and eliminate seed oils en masse, and then all of a sudden realize we're all still just as sick? Oh my goodness, it's way worse than we thought. There's so many other factors. Yeah.
yeah, well, I do think it would help, but yeah, I mean, it is it I don't like to focus on the negative too much. You have to. It's important to understand, right, that the environment that we're in is not uh, super conducive to perfect health, right? And we've listed a bunch of reasons why. Um, in particular, I think the endocrine disruptors are pretty are quite damaging. And so, but then you say, okay, but we're trying to get understanding, right? And understanding how to say, okay, so we've gotten sick, here we are, but there's ways to put it back and do it in reasonable ways that we don't, right? That we can enjoy our food and feel nourished and feel, um, like we're not starving ourselves, we're not hungry all the time, we have good food, we have healthy food, and we can slowly, I think, transition back to that. And yeah, but yeah, it starts with avoiding seed oils. I think it starts with avoiding all forms of unsaturated fat. I like butter. And people don't know that uh people like to lump, they'll say, well, saturated fat, right? And they say that's any fat that comes from an animal. Um, but there's a huge range there as well. You're right, and this is why I started Firebrand Meats. We raise pork that's low in polyunsaturated fat, and I actually just transitioned. It's now part of Nourish Cooperative, but um, butter is something like 70% saturated fat. Pork fat is something like 45 or 50% saturated fat. So it's a pretty big difference. And more, the pork fat is higher in the polyunsaturated fats. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it's the genetics of the animals. Some of it is because we now are feeding them these dried distiller grains. So in the early 2000s, we built all these um, ethanol distilleries in the northern Midwest. So we take now 30% of the U.S. corn crop gets made into ethanol that we put in our cars. And when you take corn and you remove all the starch to make ethanol, well, what's left? It's the protein and the fat, which is mostly the polyunsaturated fat. And so that dry distillers grains coming out of those ethanol refineries became a cheap food, and we started feeding it to the pigs and the chickens. And so when you do that, of course, the polyunsaturated fat content of the meat increases. And so we've had this transition where, pork, which everybody says, well, large saturated fat, right? And it's, well, commercial lard is not very saturated, especially when you compare it to something like butter, which is, which is a very saturated fat.
And what's
And
beef
so
tallow at and on that spectrum?
beef tallow is more like, beef tallow is closer to lard, but I think it's around 50% saturated, but it does have less of the polyunsaturated oils. Although I was talking to Ashley from Nourish Cooperative the other day, and she was talking about this problem where they're now giving so much vegetable oil to the cattle that it's overwhelming. The cattle do this cool trick where they can hydrogenate the fats in their rumen, and so they can take polyunsaturated fats and make them into saturated fats because of the bugs, I call them, that live in their rumen, which is really a big fermentation tank in their stomach. And so traditionally, beef was always a low source of PUFA. Ashley argued to me the other day that we're starting to overwhelm their ability to do this, and that even a lot of sources of beef are getting much higher in polyunsaturated fat. I haven't had the time to verify the veracity of these claims, but that's what some are saying.
So tallow, is that like 50-60% saturated fat, and then
right? So so beef tallow traditionally, it's from a grass-fed cow, I want to say is right around 50% saturated. If you get specifically
30-40% mono.
Yeah, well, probably more than that, probably like 45% mono. And then
is that
PUFA
too much
like
mono unsaturated fat for you to eat a lot of fatty beef?
Well, see that. So right. So
this
is where the rubber hits the road. For me, I think in my position right now, trying to lose weight, I don't want to eat, like, I'm sticking to butter that I know is going to be 70% saturated. Another thing is about beef and ruminants is that the suet fat is the kidney fat, right? My grandmother was British, and so at Christmas dinner, she always made suet pudding, and you'd buy the beef suet, which is the kidney fat, and you grind it up and you add it to this kind of a pudding of this pie thing. But beef suet can be higher. That can be up to like 60 or even 65% saturated. And so if you specifically get like the kidney fat from a grass-fed cow, it can be very, very high indeed in saturated fat. And so that's my second go-to fat after butter. I have a couple local farmers here who are doing the grass-fed thing, and I get suet from them if I want some beef fat. Yeah.
So but you're currently avoiding that suet in general because of your low fat diet.
Right. Like I say, yeah, I'm trying to stick right now to around like 20 to 25% of calories from fat. So that doesn't leave a ton of room for suet. But that's not to say that, and I actually don't have any right now, but if I did have some, I might use some of it. It is good. I like suet a lot.
Yeah.
And suet is higher in stearic acid than butter is, and I think stearic acid is beneficial. So you could make an argument for like combining butter and suet into like a cooking oil might be the best of all worlds, because it's going to be very low in MUFA, it's going to be very low in PUFA, and it's going to be high in stearic acid, and it would be very saturated.
Do you ever eat suet raw in the past?
I've never eaten it raw, although I've eaten lots of raw steak.
I've done that. I've eaten raw suet as like a snack when I went to a conference one time. It was like one of those conferences where you're trapped in this giant, conference hotel where the burgers are $30 and stuff. And
yeah,
I just wanted to be full the whole day. So I just ate a bunch of raw suet. And then I would switch it out and eat raw cocoa butter or whatever. And I eat some of that.
Right.
It's basically the same thing, they taste the same.
Yeah. A little different. The cocoa butter has a lot of the medium chain fats that are, sort of digested a little differently. So there's a little bit of difference there for sure, but yeah.
I wanted to add, so you were inspired to do this emergence diet because you were concerned about your blood glucose levels were getting a little too high consistently, right? What were they ranging at?
Well, I don't know that that was the reason that I did it. So I was around 115. I was around 115 would be my blood glucose in the morning, which is concerning. And within a week of switching to this, high starch, low protein, my blood glucose was down into the 90s, which for me was a huge win. Like I tried 30 different things to get my blood glucose down, and none of them had ever quite seemed to work until I removed the branched chain amino acids. And then another week after that, that's when I started consistently hitting, morning blood glucose levels of around 80, which I was astounded by. I still am kind of astounded by. And so it really had an immediate and dramatic, I mean, that's a 35-point drop in my fasting blood glucose levels in 2 weeks. And that's all that I did, I mean, I guess I did a lot of things, I dramatically increased starch. I cut way back on branched chain amino acids, and I increased collagen, bone broth, glycine, right? I did all three of those things, and that very rapidly normalized my blood glucose. And it kind of came out of this long process. If you go to my YouTube video channel, I think I did a video called The Emergence Diet, and I talk about bears and what do they do in the spring. And then I made a follow-up video to that called the Pre-Emergence Diet. And that was thinking about like, okay, well, when bears are hibernating, or when animals are actually still in their torpid winter state, like what's happening in them? Because that's when they're getting ready to emerge. And it was there that I pointed out that like, well, they wouldn't be burning a lot of protein at that point because, hibernating animals do this thing where they actually protect their muscle mass over the winter. So even though they don't eat any protein all winter, when they emerge in the spring, they haven't lost any muscle mass, or they've lost very little muscle mass. And so things that are obese are in this kind of protein sparing mode, which is probably the magic of why this all works, is that we're specifically, we start using that protein to put us into this insulin resistance if we do break it down, because, obviously hibernating animals are quite insulin resistant. And there's just not a lot of protein then, right? And even animals that there are animals that store food, like squirrels. So around me, we have chipmunks. Chipmunks are ground squirrels, and they actually store these hordes of like acorns and other things, and they can eat those throughout the winter, but it's still a low protein diet in the winter. And then in the summer, they'll eat more insects and other things that are higher in protein. So I was just kind of riffing on these ideas in my videos. And then over at Reddit, we have this group called r/saturated fat, where they talk about a lot of these ideas. And people on there started trying this protein restriction idea. And I posted that there's a group, and I normally know the name of the research group right now, but the Lambing Lab. The guy's last name is Lambing. They had posted these videos in mice saying, yes, if you restrict, you can have these mice and they're eating starch and they're eating fat, but if you restrict the branched chain amino acids specifically, they'll become lean and they won't have metabolic syndrome. And so I posted that, and people on Reddit started doing it. And then that's when I thought, maybe I should try this too. And so that sort of led to me really trialing this, the emergence diet, as I'm calling it. And of course it's a lot of different things. The collagen came from a different line of reasoning, but it all kind of dovetails together. And I had sort of come, looking over the years, looking at the difference between humans with metabolic syndrome and lean humans, and the parallels between humans with metabolic syndrome and hibernating animals. To me, it became inevitable that what we were looking at is that the humans with metabolic syndrome have insulin resistance, and they're not good at burning blood glucose. Is what I see at the end of the day, right? And so that was what was making me want to try more the kind of high starch approach, which I'd never done before, right? I've done a lot of keto my adult life. And the one thing I knew about keto was, so keto's helped me a lot in the past, right? But at the same time, I always knew that if I did keto, I wasn't fixed. I had to stay strictly keto for it to keep working, right? And so so even though I've gotten a lot of benefit out of it, I thought, I want to go a different way this time and try something else. And that has sort of led me to this higher starch approach.
What is the proposed pathway that would suggest that this restricted protein, higher starch emergence diet would not require you to stay in it, just like you said, keto kind of requires you to stay in there to keep the weight off?
Right. And so that's a really interesting question, right? And one of the things that we know,
that's really the biggest question everybody wants to know, because everybody knows,
right?
Everybody knows that there are diets that work. Let's just kind of set the table for this before you dive in. People know their diets work in terms of getting the weight off. It's the hardest part about all diets is, that you have to stay in that, and they're so restrictive that nobody wants to stay there forever. And so therefore they just throw up their hands with exasperation, right? And so that's the holy grail is a diet that you can do that you don't have to do the rest of your life.
Right. No, absolutely. Of course.
Yeah.
And so just to add to that, and we were chatting about this last night, but, in the lab, you can show in rodent models, in mice and in rats, that we can take these. So mice, if you put them on a high starch, very low fat diet that has a lot of protein in it, they will stay. They'll stay lean essentially forever, and their kids will stay lean, and their kids will stay lean. And then we shift them onto this specific diet that's has a lot of fat in it. It's mostly lard. It's got a little bit of soybean oil in there, and that will make these mice fat, kind of in that. Well, most of them, it will make them fat. If you then take those mice and put them back onto that first diet that is starch with the high protein, but it's low fat, they never go back to being as lean as the original mice, right? So it's like once you make them fat, they stay fat, right? You can't put them back onto the original trajectory by putting them back onto the initial diet.
And the fats you mentioned there, soy and lard, are high in PUFA. So
yeah, they're high in MUFA and PUFA.
So is there any diet that shows the rats eating a high fat and high starch diet and high protein, but it's saturated fat? And how do they do if they did that?
They have some models where they do some diet-induced obesity using butter fat, but it's I think they use a lot more sugar in those. I should look more closely at those, because I don't know what they do. But like, one of the things that got me into this was seeing that mice who were eating they were giving them stearic acid, like pure stearic acid. So they were doing the high fat diet that would normally make the mice fat, but they were feeding them all saturated fat. And those mice were had shredded abs, like they had no fat on their bodies.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of got me. That's one of the things that got me thinking more about fat saturation levels, and it maybe people are wrong about these unsaturated fats. And so we have some evidence. There's also studies of there's studies from the 90s where they took rats and they gave them different beef tallow versus soybean oil versus olive oil, and inevitably the ones on the unsaturated fats have more what they call lipogenic enzymes. Lipogenic just means fat making. So the unsaturated fats upregulate their fat making systems, and they have more, and they gain more weight, and they have more liver fat in the unsaturated fat rats. This is specifically, I'm thinking of a study on rats. And so there seems to be some consistency of this idea, right? And so I think that, so my opinion is that the reason that the mice or the rats, once they become fat, the reason that they stay fat is that their body fat has become very unsaturated, right? They have these stores of fat, and those fats themselves are unsaturated. And that unsaturated fat that is stored in their body is contributing to their ongoing insulin resistance, right? And so then the question is, okay, well, how do we break out of this? And it turns out that people have maybe heard of NAD or NAD plus or NADH. They sell it as supplements, but this is a compound that's extraordinarily important to our metabolism. It's a very low level thing happening in the mitochondria, and different fuels affected in different ways. And essentially, whether or not you have saturated fat or unsaturated fat seems to be tightly related to this kind of ratio of NAD plus to NADH. And the starch, when you consume starch, your NAD plus availability rises compared to NADH, and that's the key to this whole thing. Is if you get up in the morning and you have a big starchy meal, then your NAD plus levels are going to rise, and hopefully that will help you go on a path back towards having a more saturated body fat. And once that happens, I think that can kick you out of that momentum that obese things have, where they're full of these unsaturated fats. If you look at, there's a study in 1961 where they looked at these tribes in Nigeria. And what they showed is that these starch-eating tribes have really saturated body fat, especially compared to, modern Americans, right? Like their body fat was 40% saturated. And I think lard is 40% saturated. And so American or Nigerian starch-eating cultures, 1960, had 40% saturated body fat. Modern Americans have something like 28% saturated body fat. And so
does that include those who are not obese?
Yes, that's all of us. So
everybody could be in a state of torpor even if they're not obese or overweight, right?
Yeah, well, I think so. And then you look at also the other, people who are not overweight are suffering from, depression, anxiety, all of these other kind of mental conditions. And I think those presumably have, a lot of the same metabolic sources, right? And so we've had this, like we are literally all made of different. We're literally composed differently than we were, 60 years ago. And to me, that's where, and so I look at that and I say, how do we get this back? And the first obvious thing is to stop eating unsaturated fats, but that won't necessarily fix it on its own, because what happens is you're full of PUFA and MUFA, and you try to burn that, and it kind of saps your NAD plus, and it leads to these inflammatory pathways, and all these things happen so that when you consume glucose, when you consume starch, instead of burning it and starting to resaturate, what happens is we start doing glycolysis with it. It makes, we make fat out of it, and that fat is inevitably going to be monounsaturated fat because NAD plus is low. It's a whole, there's this whole pathway where, trying to return to a starch-based diet can still be problematic. And so that's why I'm, I do certain supplements that I like. That's why I'm restricting the protein, because I think, this is a complicated problem. And, one of the things that I like, this isn't something I sell, but, it's called alpha lipoic acid. And it's this thing, we make it in our bodies, we make it in all of our mitochondria, and you take it and it literally just goes into your mitochondria and it oxidizes NADH back to NAD plus, which is, I think, at the core root of this problem. And it's shown great results in all these human experimental trials. right? Clinical trials.
What are people
And
usually
so there are
using?
some
What are
simple,
people
so in my
usually?
opinion, there are some simple things that we can do that can really give us some leverage out
What
of
are
the
people usually
situation.
using alpha lipoic acid for, anyways? Like typically, or,
It's used for a lot of things. It's been, it's one of those things that we've known about for a long, long time. I think it gets prescribed. My friend, it's funny. I have a good friend who suffers from, depression and has for a long time. And I went to visit her, and she said that she was seeing someone. I don't know if it was a psychiatrist, and they had given her some supplements. And I said, "Can I see what they are?" And the first thing she had was alpha lipoic acid. And so I think it is used in the mental health profession a lot. And I think I see a lot of parallels between, um, metabolic syndrome and kind of mental health syndromes and depression and these things like this, right? I think they all have kind of a metabolic origin, um, and so that's one that I like. I sell this thing called SEA, which is steroyl ethanolamide at fireinabottle.net/shop, and that one is designed to actually mimic like we were 60 years ago when our body fat was higher in stearic acid. It's something that your body makes from stearic acid. And those early studies from the 1960s showed people, or there's an earlier one. There's one from 1943 in America, and in that study, people had like 8% stearic acid.
yeah.
And if you look at studies today, this is in your fat tissue. If you look at studies today, it's like 3.5 or 3.25% typically, instead of 8%, as was reported in 1943. So that's really a massive decline. And the stearic acid, it acts as a signaling molecule, and the SEA is your fat cells make it from the stearic acid that they have, and it's involved in inflammatory pathways. It binds to this thing called NFKB, which is this old school pro-inflammatory transcription factor, and it blocks it from starting the inflammatory cascade. And it also binds to your it's part of your endocannabinoid system. And so your body makes these essentially cannabinoids, and people talk about cannabis giving them the munchies, right? And so the cannabinoid system is very involved in appetite regulation, and it's involved in metabolic rate, and the SEA helps break down the other endocannabinoids that are actually triggering that cannabinoid system. And so it looks like this fat composition, to me, it looks like the fat composition is very instrumental in causing this momentum that we see with obesity. And we need to figure out how to kind of resaturate. And I think that will go a long ways towards restoring our metabolisms.
Why do you think, have you heard of Dr. Chris Palmer, a Harvard psychiatrist? Have you heard of him?
I don't know him, no.
I've had him on the show through the years, and he was always finding like remediation of symptoms of or even bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia in his patients that he treats as a psychiatrist. He would put them in basically kind of like remission when he would put them into a ketogenic diet. So ketogenic. So the keto, let me see if I can connect this. The ketogenic diet, in a metaphorical sense, is like doing an Aikido move to go with to kind of like, you have a disease state of your mitochondria are dysfunctional, and it's creating mood disorders. It's creating all kinds of psychological problems, and it's creating obesity and a whole other host of issues. And the ketogenic diet is basically kind of like an Aikido move to like take the momentum of that disease state and kind of like work within it to create an alternative pathway of being lean and healthy, and kind of mitigating the effects of that disease state. and what you're trying to do is kind of like to fight against it and to reverse. Is that, I'm trying to help me come up with some
Yeah,
imagery for this.
we kind of had messaged about this last night, and I did look at a couple studies, and because this is something that I haven't researched and I should research more. By the way, can I tell the audience I'm thinking about starting my own lab, because I might just like set up a lab in the basement of my house, because I want to. There's a lot of simple questions like this that we don't have answers to. And the question is, what does ketogenesis do to the NAD plus to NADH ratio in our tissues? And there is evidence out there. The keto diet, like you say, traditionally has been used for epilepsy. And so there's a lot more information about how keto affects the brain than there are other tissues of the body. And it does seem like when you're in ketosis, it increases the NAD plus availability in the brain. So that's really interesting. And so
that's
essentially,
that's what you want to happen in all the parts of the body, not just
that's what I want to happen in all the parts of the body.
Okay.
And the other parts of the body are just not as well studied in terms of the NAD plus to NADH ratio. But it's interesting that I think this NADH, the NAD plus to NADH ratio issue is so fundamental to all of this. And it's, even though we've known about it since the 50s, I think, as this fundamental thing, it hasn't really gotten the attention that it deserves. I think it got a little bit, I think when I came through school, all of the young molecular biologists wanted to focus on genes and gene pathways, and it was all about genetics and epigenetics. And now looking back on it, I think, we should have stuck a little more to the basic biochemistry. I think people forgot a lot about the basic biochemistry, and they were cloning. I mean, I know that's what I did, right? I was off cloning genes. And
but by the way, that focus on genetics versus metabolism is infected in all of medicine, and it's infected even into plant nutrition and botany. I just had a botanist on last week, and everything, all the research funding and money goes into trying to figure out genetic solutions for diseases of the plants and trees that farmers have, and hardly anything goes back to kind of the metabolic dysfunction of the basic biochemistry. It's just interesting how that, I always like to look at the patterns of errors and why they're happening like that. But,
right. Yeah. No. And I think,
I think that's track if I did.
No, it's fine. No, and I think that's right. I think that's what happened. I lived that journey. Like, I, as a young person, was extraordinarily interested in the genetics because it was this new science, right? And it was the new thing. And it was, it's like kids coming out of school right now are probably interested in AI, right? And I know my friends' kids who graduated, 6 years ago, all they cared about was Bitcoin and crypto, you know what I mean? And so the time that you become an adult, right, and enter the world, and that's just what you're interested in at that moment, and that's what you tend to focus on in your career. And so genetics was this big new thing, and we all got swept up in it. And now I'm like, no, we just need to know more about NAD plus and NADH. And so I've been, this morning I was looking for used lab equipment on eBay, because I'm like, if anyone, by the way, wants to invest in a small science lab, go to fireinabottle.net and click on the contact link there. Send me a message. Because for not a whole lot of money, I think we could learn a tremendous amount, right? Like, I think I could get all the equipment that I need for like 10 grand. And we could start there's so many unanswered questions in this, like, just simple things like, what does feeding ketones to muscle tissue, how does it affect the NAD plus to NADH ratio? And there's some great tools out there that we can now, there are these genetic tools that we can actually visualize the NAD plus to NADH ratio in real time in the mitochondria versus in the rest of the cell. And we can do this in tissue culture, and these are fast and kind of easy experiments to do. But as far as I can see, no one is doing them. We could answer real quickly a lot of these questions about how does how do ketones affect, the NAD plus availability in all these different tissues? We could answer questions like, how are the antioxidants? So I also think we've gotten antioxidants backwards. And I think the antioxidants are limiting in certain scenarios. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not saying antioxidants are bad or anything like that, but I think there's scenarios, if you take high dose vitamin E, you might be limiting NAD plus availability. And I think that alpha lipoic acid is increasing that availability. But again, these things all could be fleshed out a lot more, pardon the pun.
Yeah. Another broad question is like, how long do you, for example, tabling the keto comparison for a second, how long do you have to do this emergence diet, low branch chain amino acid diet before you know that your ratio, if that is what the main corrective thing is happening, your ratio is correct, and therefore you can then return to a more normal balanced diet? Like, how long? What if it takes 7 years? Like, and then another question that comes to mind is like, why is it that so many people say keto, like you said, you have to stay on it? It's like a medicine that you have to stay on, because that was something that Chris Palmer said, is that whenever he would take, and he wrote a book, so maybe his data has added more since I talked to him, but that as long as he kept his patients in the state of ketosis, the voices in their head would go away, but then once they try to adjust back to a normal diet with the carbs back in and whatever, the voices came back, and so to speak. So that makes you wonder, like, is it not switching that NAD plus ratio right? Or what's going on? Why isn't keto being able to solve the problem and let people go? Or perhaps is it that you have to stay on it a certain amount of years or something and produce a certain level of ketones consistently without breaks, and that heals the ratio, and then you can go back to normal. But a lot of people don't find that to be the case. You're right. They have to stay on low carb basically as a continual drug that they have to enter into every whatever, just to kind of maintain whatever they get to, whenever they get.
Right. And I wonder if, right. And so just riffing on things we've already touched on in this episode about what could be things that are causing you to have to stay in this ketosis. One is if your body fat is still very unsaturated, when you reintroduce carbs, my expectation is that you will be you're going to be insulin resistant. You're not going to. Here's the problem about going through a high starch diet is you have to actually be able to burn the starch. And if you've been in a keto diet, you're inevitably going to be insulin resistant when you go back to the starch, right? And so you maybe have to go to sort of I don't want to say extreme measures, but you have to really understand it when you switch back out, right? And so if you come out of keto and you are combining, like we said before, if you say, okay, well, I'm going to add starch, I'm going to start eating potatoes with my steak, right? Well, now you're just adding carbohydrates into a situation where I suspect you're going to be very insulin resistant, right? And your
body has not had a long time of learning how to do it, right? Is that the issue?
A lot of reasons. One, your body hasn't had a long time to learn how to do it. Two, your body fat might be pretty unsaturated. And so now you have into your mitochondria, you have starch going in, but you also have unsaturated fat going in. And that unsaturated fat makes you insulin resistant.
But maybe, excuse my ignorance, but if you're eating a super high saturated fat diet, it won't eventually convert over to a higher saturated percentage of your body fat? It'll still be unsaturated?
Well, not necessarily, because you have enzymes that are desaturating it all the time.
SCD1 you talk about?
Yeah. SCD1, but also D6D and D5D and SCD2 and SCD5. These are and all these desaturase enzymes are driven by the NADH level. So if you have a lot of NADH, you're going to have unsaturated fat. And that unsaturated fat is going to, when you try to burn it, is the unsaturated fat itself lowers NAD plus availability and keeps you in that state. And so this ratio, if you look at humans, the ratio of oleic acid to stearic acid is called the desaturase index, and that index is associated with development of diabetes. It's connected to obesity. It's, and you can predict the onset of diabetes because you have a lot of monounsaturated fat and not much stearic acid. You probably will become diabetic.
So if you don't fix that problem and you do ketosis, and then every now and then you're going back to regular carbs and back and forth, you might be contributing to an accelerated direction towards diabetes, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, this is what I see, right? Is I see a lot of people trying to do dirty keto, people will call it. This idea of, well, I'm doing ketosis, but I also want to get better at having better glucose metabolism, and then you just start combining, and now you're eating, meat and potatoes, and you probably have unsaturated body fat, and you're just kind of, continuing down that same path that I don't love. And so it's like, what I wonder is this: if his patients went from keto straight to something like the emergence diet, where it was, it was protein constricted, and where it was protein constricted and where it was very high in starch, would they see those same problems? Or is it because they're doing this kind of dirty keto, combining all the macros and creating problems?
Yeah. Is there, just like you said, that if you do keto long term, your body is not going to be necessarily good at burning glucose. Does the same thing happen? I don't know the gentleman's name, but you were on a show he's a vegetarian guy, and he was talking about how he did super low fat and was eating pounds of bananas or whatever. But then whenever he would add the fat back in, he would just gain all of his weight back or whatever. So is there a similar effect that happens when your body becomes inefficient at handling fat when you've restricted fat long enough? Or in the same vein, is there a similar type of effect that can happen to your body as it pertains to restricting protein long term when you try to go back to a more normal level of proteins, especially the BCAAs that you're restricting? Does that, if you restrict them long enough, just like on ketosis, does that create, with the keto guy, a inability to burn glucose efficiently, and with the low BCAA, inability to burn that, and then maybe the low fat guy has a problem burning the fat when he consumes it again? Is that all of those possible, or no, they work differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all possible, and I think that, there, despite the fact that I kind of threw genetics under the bus, genetics still is real, right? And we all are genetically different, and epigenetics matter, right? And I don't want to suggest that they don't. Like, we're all genetically different, and so there's always this interaction between what you eat and your genetics, and your epigenetics, what your mother ate, and and then we have this momentum that is kept through, like I say, through your body fat saturation and these enzyme systems, and probably also our epigenetics. And so, yeah, I think it's easy to get into situations where you can handle certain fuels better than others, and everybody's going to be different. And I think that, I don't know. I remember him saying that. You're talking about, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I think his show is called Low Carb Regenerator. High carb regenerator. That's what it's called. Yeah. And so, yeah, no, I think, and I don't know what fats he was using, but if he was using unsaturated fats, I would expect,
that's true.
I would expect exactly that to happen. Right. And but I think the less that we mix all these things, the better it might be for a lot of people. Like, I think that's like a go-to move if you need to lose weight might be to just focus on, like, just picking a macro, whether you'd rather eat starch or whether you'd rather eat mostly fat, or if you want to eat all lean protein, and sort of just do that for a while, right? That's like I don't love either of those solutions long term. I think you'll very quickly get tired of any of those diets, but like as a right as like a blunt instrument to like I'm stuck and I'm not making any progress and
Yeah.
I want to get some
Yeah.
motion going forward, you know, that would be a way to do it.
Tucker
Like there's a
Goodrich,
guy
oh, go ahead.
another guy called X Fat Loss, who also is on R saturated fat a lot of times, but he's just been consuming this like whipped heavy cream.
Yeah.
And so his diet is like, oh, it's, you know, it's almost pure fat. It's very low protein, and it's very saturated. And he's been able to lose, I think, 60 plus pounds doing that. And so that obviously that's quite restrictive. You can't do that forever. But it's another, you know, it's a way to kind of right kick us out of this problem where we're, you know, in our, you look right, and it starts in our bloodstream. If you look at the bloodstream, like people with metabolic syndrome tend to have high free fatty acids, which are the you know, that's sort of where the rubber hits the road, right? The free fatty acids is the fat that has been released from your fat stores, and it's in your blood, and it's pushing into mitochondria to try to get burned. They also have high branched chain amino acids. The branched chain amino acids are doing the same thing, and they probably also have high blood glucose, and the blood glucose is doing the same thing, right? So you have these elevated amino acids, you have this elevated glucose, and you have these elevated fats, and they're all pushing into the mitochondria, and you get into the situation. I like to make this analogy of like a carburetor, in that carburetor is the thing that when the fuel goes into your car, you switch how much air and how much gas is going into the pistons, and if you have too much fuel and not enough oxygen, it doesn't burn cleanly. And so to me, that is the dominant analogy that I see, is we have high levels of amino acids and glucose and fat, and they're all, you know, pushing into the carburetor, and we're not getting enough oxygen to kind of mix it with cleanly.
And that's called reductive stress, right? That's what Dr.
Right.
Ray
And that's
Peat,
basically right.
Dr.
And that's
Ray
basically
Peat
the
talked about
definition
that.
of reductive stress.
Yeah.
And so then what you can do, and so the reason that I like starch, and I'll say this, is what happens is if you eat a big starchy meal that's low in fat and it's low in protein, aka cassava porridge for breakfast, right, which is what I've been doing, the insulin will suppress the free fatty acids, and it will suppress the branched chain amino acids. And so it helps those other fuels get out of the way, so that the only fuel going into your, or not the only fuel, but the main fuel going into your mitochondria becomes the glucose. And
why is it that but starches, like Ray Peat has suggested, that starches, eating them a lot can elevate your glucose more than sugars, like simple sugars from fruit and table sugar? Is that because you're eating them in the context of high protein, of the high BCAA? Is that what's making?
Yeah, I think there's concerns in the Ray Peat community about the effect of starch on gut bacteria and the gut microbiome.
Yeah.
I am less concerned about that issue. I think that my concern is that if you eat too much sugar, that can actually increase the expression of of SCD1, the desaturase enzyme. So given those two options, I like to concentrate on the starch. But that's that debate will probably go on for a long time.
Do you think that starches are not contributive to endotoxin buildup, or you just don't look at that area as an issue for you right now?
I think that when I look at historical cultures around the world, what I see is that the cultures in Africa and the cultures in South America, like that Tsimane forager farmers who live in Bolivia and who eat cassava and green plantains and are eating very high starch diets, have some of the fastest metabolic rates in the world. And there's a lot of healthy traditional cultures who are living on a starch-based diet, and I don't see the humans living on the fruit-based diets in traditional cultures so much. And that might purely be convenience, and that starches are store better and are easier to have a year-round supply of. But when I don't know, I tend to fall back on history and what I see historical cultures doing. And it seems to me like starch has been that thing.
But particularly the issue about Ray Pete suggesting that starches elevate glucose more than sugar. What is that caused by? Is that the BCAA starches? Maybe because people are eating bread or corn or whatever?
Well, I think so.
Or is that
You have so there's two issues, right? One is there's the immediate postprandial increase, like right after the meal, your increase in blood glucose, and then there's your fasting blood glucose in the morning. So you might get a higher spike out of starch than you would out of eating fruit. I don't mind that. I sort of almost see that as a good thing because once I've switched to high starch, I know that my fasting glucose is going to be low. I think that influx of glucose is going to, stimulate the release of insulin. That insulin is going to cause me to be able to burn that glucose, which is really what we want, because glucose does a host of things, insulin does a host of things to help us to actually burn glucose. So like I say, one of those things is reducing free fatty acids, and another one is reducing and another one is reducing branched chain amino acids. And a third thing is it activates pyruvate dehydrogenase, which is the limiting factor in our ability to actually burn glucose oxidatively in the mitochondria. And so I can live with a blood glucose spike in the hour after I eat, cassava. I'm fine with that, I guess.
It's not making you sleepy or anything? The crash?
No, I'm not sleepy in the hour after I eat cassava. Like, I might get sleepy in the afternoon, but
that's not the same as torpor sleepy.
Doesn't matter,
right? Is that torpor sleepy, or what is that?
It's not the same as torpor. Yeah.
What is that?
Torpor is just kind of a general low energy, which a lot of people have in the winter anyway, but no need to contribute to it. And so I don't know. I just, my personal experience has shown me that a starch-based diet is gone a huge way towards fixing certainly fixing my fasting blood glucose. I mean, I was pre-diabetic before. Now I'm not, right? And that's because of the high starch diet, the high starch and the high collagen diet.
The collagen is just as important as the starch, you think, right? And this.
Yeah, I think so. And like I say, you can get stuck with going back to a starch-based diet. This is very clear. And so I think the way that you do it is very important. And I think that a lot of people have had that experience of I was keto, or I was this, or I was that. And then they went back and they added carbohydrates and they added starch. And then they started to have all the same problems that they had before. And that, to me, I think you would if you do it the wrong way, right?
But if you're doing it this way, how do you know you're not going to have problems? I know I said it before, but
I don't know yet. I mean, my like I say,
what's your hypothesis or suggestions?
My hypothesis, very simply put, is this: if you can efficiently burn blood glucose, it increases NAD plus availability and it lowers NADH. If you can do that consistently, you'll wind up with more saturated body fat. You'll wind up with higher levels.
What's the process for that? Is that 5 years, 7 years of this diet before you can?
I suspect it'll be shorter. My suspicion is like, I don't know, 2 years. That's really just shooting from the hip. I don't know. In that 2 years, you can make a pretty significant change. We'll see, time will tell. But what I have found with this diet is that, I've only been doing this since October. I've already had two sort of like major cheat windows. The first one was the holidays, and I was traveling, and my father went into the hospital right after Thanksgiving. And so I was away from home a lot. I was eating on the road, eating with my family at the holidays. And then this recent time after my father passed, I took, another 2 weeks where I was around my family all the time and they're cooking all these food all the time. And so, but both times when I've gotten home and switched back onto this diet, immediately I've gone right back to having perfect blood glucose again, and the pounds gained over those times have come right back off. And so so far I'm very happy with how this is working, and also the ability to kind of be flexible with it. I think
it may be, is it possible? I mean, let's try to get some assumptions or predictions. It could be that it's like less damaging on your body to have a cheat day on this diet and add some fats and proteins back in than it is to do a cheat day on a ketogenic diet when your body is more unsaturated than it should be. Is that a theory there, or has
possibly
no basis there? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I'm trying to think
I
of
guess
what's the healthiest way for folks who are struggling with this, whether they're overweight or not. Like so many people know keto. Keto's kind of the reigning champ of alternative diet world, right? It got there. It's battled. It's the reigning champ in terms of people's public awareness of it, right? You could go to any little old lady in Walmart and tell her about keto, and she broadly knows what that means. They don't know about this other path that you're talking about, and so
no, they don't. And so and obviously this is very different. Keto is sort of the way I like to think about it. Is that keto is sort of like, okay, you have this problem that you can't burn blood glucose, right? That's the problem. And so you can so keto is sort of like, you're like, okay, I can't burn blood glucose, so I just won't eat carbohydrates, and it kind of fixes your problem. I'm trying to go the opposite way of, well, I want to get better at burning blood glucose, right? And so I think my belief is that if you can get better at burning blood glucose in the long term, it can fix a lot of your metabolic problems, and that then you can be more flexible going forward.
Is there a test you can do or something that will show you, oh, wow, I'm really saturated now, I'm ready to go?
I mean, one thing, there's Omega Quant has a kit to check your, you do a little blood spot called the complete Omega Quant complete test, I think it's called, but it costs, I think it's like $100. I have a promo code FIRE. If you try the test, punch that in, you'll save $10, I think. But like you basically, you put your, you make a blood spot, and they'll send you back the fats that they find in your phospholipids. So in your membrane lipids, you can get a panel of all of what your fat composition is. It's not my favorite spot to test. I wish they would test a different tissue, but right now that's the test that we have. And a lot of people have posted their results, again, over on that Reddit group, r/saturated fat. And so there's a lot of discussion over there, and people have looked at a lot of these from a lot of different people, and people talk about how theirs has changed over time. So that, to my knowledge, is the best test in the US that we have.
Have you measured it since you've been on this diet to see if it's improved?
No, but I need to do it. Now that I've got a good long stretch here where I'm not planning on going anywhere. I'm going to be home. I'm going to be strict. So I'm kind of hoping to get, like I say, I want to lose another 20 or 30 pounds, and then I will get that test done again.
I have a couple questions that are kind of random, but I want to get, my friend Susie Alexander, she goes to the different places. I don't know if you've seen her work, but she went over to the Maasai people, and she was studying what they were eating and living amongst them. And she reported back that, we just did a new interview with her. You can see it on our show, but she estimates that the men there are drinking 6 liters of milk a day, which is about 1.5 gallons. And they're having blood, and then they're eating meat from their pastorally raised, animals, ruminant animals, I guess, primarily goats, sheep, cows. They're eating that about 2 to 3 times a week. but they're primarily like they have like a chai tea with some type of herbs and bark and not herbs, excuse me. I think it might be some of that, but it's bark and their milk, and it's like a tea, and they put cane sugar in it, and that's their breakfast, and they just drink. So that, I think, I thought that was very Ray Pete affirming.
Yeah.
Remember what and she showed me the macro breakdown on her slide, which you got to watch. It's really good on her show, but it showed that that it came out to about 5,000 calories a day for the men. And remember what Ray Pete said? He said, when he was, and he said that, she said that the Messiah said that the key to longevity and their view is to keep moving, don't sit around all day. Right. And I
Right.
wonder how much that has to really do with whatever diet path you go down, this keep moving approach. But they're eating 5,000 calories a day, and it's casual walking, lots of casual walking. They're not doing high intense cardio at the gym. But that's similar to what Ray Pete said. He said when in the 1950s, remember, he told us that he was working for the U.S. Forestry Department, and he was planting trees and just doing brisk walking or casual walking, eating 5,000 calories a day, and he was very pro milk. And here we
Yeah.
have people drinking 1.5 gallons of milk a day, which is going to have fat. Now, their fat, I think their
Well,
ratio of fat and carbs is different and sugar than our milk, and the
right.
zebra milk.
But let's also remember that, I have argued and have been arguing that the root of, right. There's two issues. The first question is, why did we have these problems in the first place? And now the question is, okay, but how do we fix it? But these guys are not consuming any unsaturated fats, right? As I said before, dairy fat is 70% saturated. And so, I think as long as you stay on that path of, this is what the French do, right? The French eat, the normal French breakfast is baguettes with butter and jam. Right. And this is you're combining fat and you're combining carbs. The bread has some protein, but it's butter. Right. And that keeps you able to burn that glucose. Same with the Maasai. The milk fat is going to stay out of the way. It's going to let you burn the carbs when you have to burn the carbs. Everything stays, you can stay in that plane, and it works. Seems like it works forever. Right. The Maasai have been eating this way for a long time. And it keeps working. I do really think that it's when you add in the unsaturated fats that you start to see problems.
Have you measured, or has there been any studies measuring French people to see what their NADH or plus, is it NADH plus?
So there are very few papers, almost none, looking at NAD plus and NADH in humans, right? Okay. I don't want to say almost none. There's not nearly as many as you would like to see, and this is what I want to start doing in this theoretical lab that I might make. But there is a study. I did a deep dive on all of the papers that reported fat composition, adipose tissue composition, right? And I said that stearic acid has gone from 5 to 8% as reported in the 43 and throughout the 60s. And now when you look at papers, it's 3 or it's 3.25 or it's 3.5, right? So you've seen this drop. But the one outlier is French women. There was a study done in French women in 2010, sometime around there. And they still had 5% stearic acid in their adipose tissues. And that's the only outlier that I found.
Wow.
So
if, for knowing what you know now based on your investigation of this diet, for those who want to do keto, would you recommend for weight loss or whatever, would you recommend the higher protein, lower fat way of doing keto, or the high fat, lower protein approach?
I mean, I would definitely recommend the higher fat, low protein. Having said that, there is the other pattern can and does work for a lot of people, which is the essentially, the high protein. I tried this briefly after I did the original emergence diet video, the old one, where I tried like lean chicken breast and salad kind of a thing. I don't like that diet long term. It's fun for like a day or two, and then I get sick of eating like chicken breasts. um,
There's not
but
lean. There's
and whey
not lean enough.
protein.
There's not lean enough meats to do that on, or in red, ruminant meats.
You can do it, sure. I mean, you could
Yeah.
eat top round
Yeah.
is a lean cut out of
Yeah.
meat that's or bottom round is actually better than top round. And I know I was doing that too. I was making roast beef out of bottom round. Bottom round is delicious, by the way. Underrated cut of beef. And that's a lean cut of beef. So yeah, you can do it in. I was doing roast beef, and I was doing chicken breast, and I was doing, some boiled eggs and things like that. But and that pattern does work for some people. It did not work for me. I didn't lose any weight on that diet. I know other people who have told me that they don't lose weight on that style of diet. But I do know that for a lot of people, that style diet does work. And it probably, who knows the complexities of exactly why in one person it does and another person it doesn't. But
But if you increase your fat, I'm just looking at all these variables. If you keep your fat high, like saturated fat, like dairy fat, like you said, that guy doing the cream, and then you're eating, let's say you're eating cream and beef tendon and stuff like that, right? Could that
right.
be a way to get that BCAA stuff resolved without lowering the fat, because you're lowering carb and you're lowering your BCAAs, and you're eating, like I said, high fat with lots of gelatin proteins.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an interesting approach, and
any of your people in that group doing that?
I don't know of anyone specifically doing that. I'd be very curious what the outcome of that would be, though, if people want to try it. And I'm not as good at keeping up on social media, so it is possible that there are people over at our saturated fat doing exactly that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it'd be a valid approach. I mean, another thing that we've talked about is the idea of doing like waking up, doing the kind of emergence diet that I'm doing now, where it's like, okay, in the morning, I want to get my glucose metabolism going. I wake up, I have my cassava, right? And maybe I do the same thing at lunch, but then maybe dinner is a more keto. I'm getting ready to go to bed. You inevitably are going to become, you sort of become more insulin resistant at night because you haven't eaten in a long time, and insulin levels go down, free fatty acids increase, and so there's a possibility that you could sort of shift in the day between the two, which I think would be a lot better strategy than, sort of meat and potatoes, right? So that's yet another possibility that cool. People would maybe give you, like you say, like the best sort of if you wanted to try for a sort of best of both worlds solution, it might be something like that, like cassava for breakfast, potatoes for lunch, and steak for dinner, right? And then but I don't know. I haven't tried that yet.
Eggs.
I'm not necessarily recommending it. It's interesting.
Yeah. You eat eggs, don't you? In your diet, right? You eat eggs.
I don't eat a lot of them, but I'll use an egg in the pan. Like when I make the cassava flour pancakes in the morning, I use an egg because it helps it helps them get cakey and fluffy and nice.
Yeah. I want to ask you real quick. We'll land the plane here, but I saw this email that nutrition scientist Chris Masterjohn sent in November in response to your initial report, right? About your restriction of BCAAs creating a situation where he was you're improving your glucose, and he said this was his response to this. He said, there is no rational reason to ever measure glucose alone. As an index of diabetes, even, it is horrible. diabetes is a disease, in quotes, of elevated glucose, ketones, free fatty acids, lactate, and triglycerides. I put disease in quotations because all it is in its type 2 manifestation is a broad collection of issues causing global dysregulation of energy metabolism. The fact that there are common risk factors like obesity and sedentariness that have risen to great heights in the whole population, making the prevalence of diabetes rise with time, hides the fact that the remainder of the risk factors are highly idiosyncratic. Case in point, high protein decreases my blood glucose, and BCAAs do not stand out as majorly different than protein, but I can give myself a blood sugar of 111 milligrams with biotin or some other nutrient that puts stress on complex 1 of the respiratory chain. Why BCAAs are an idiosyncratic risk factor for his, meaning you, Brad, for his latent potential to become diabetic, and why biotin is an idiosyncratic risk factor for my latent potential risk to become diabetic is infinitely more useful knowledge than the fact that all of us could reduce our probability of activating this latent potential by being lean and active. So go forth and be lean and active. Meanwhile, let's figure out the highly actionable idiosyncratic portion. Here are 3 reasons BCAAs would raise your glucose. BCAAs all require coenzyme A to be metabolized. So does the pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme. If the BCAA pathways complete themselves, CoA comes and goes. It is used and freed. There is no problem. If they get stuck in the middle, CoA becomes trapped and pyruvate dehydrogenase cannot move forward. Pyruvate rises and spills over into lactate. Glycolysis slows and glucose rises. Glucose, pyruvate, and lactate all rise together. He talks about another way BCAAs disproportionately funnel into complex 2 of the mitochondrial respiratory chain, making them somewhat closer to fat and further away from carbs and how they enter the respiratory chain. If the problem was complex 2 impairment, this would cause reverse electron transport into complex 1, elevate the NADH to NAD plus ratio, and elevate lactate without elevating pyruvate. Glycolysis would slow. Glucose and lactate would rise together, but pyruvate would not. If BCAAs were simply competing with glucose as a source of energy, the ATP yield would slow glycolysis, but there would be no impact on pyruvate or lactate. Glucose would rise alone. If BCAAs were competing with glucose at the level of acetyl-CoA entering the citric acid cycle due to limited supply of oxaloacetate,
Oxaloacetate, yeah.
acetyl-CoA would slow pyruvate dehydrogenase and convert itself into ketone bodies. Ketones and glucose would rise with a lesser rise in pyruvate and lactate. So, I'll just leave it there, but he's just saying that there's so many other factors involved besides reading the glucose about this to see if it's, I guess,
So there are a lot of factors, and I've we pointed out the difference that we are genetically different, and there are differences. At the same time, my belief is that the issue with branched chain amino acids are more fundamental than with all due respect than Chris Masterjohn thinks, and we have a good relationship.
Yeah.
And so and to his point where we should also be measuring lactate, etc. I think that's true, but I wish there were better tests that were easier to do, that were more affordable, that we could test more of these things. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to test all these things, and I'd like to see them sort of before and after the meal. I'm trying to figure out better ways to track a lot of these things because it might help clear up some of these answers. But what I can say is that, when you look at, what does insulin do, right? I just made a video called "What Does Insulin Do?" Insulin lowers free fatty acids and it lowers branched chain amino acids, and that allows glucose to burn. And I think that is a kind of a rock solid statement that we can make that is true. In general, the branched chain amino acids. And there's a lot of different reasons why this could or might be, and I don't think we know all the answers. But it does seem like there is something specifically about branched chain amino acids that have the potential to inhibit the burning of glucose in a lot of different people. And so I see it as, and we have mouse, a lot of data in mice, but also in human clinical trials now that show that branched chain amino acids, circulating branched chain amino acids are very strongly correlated with insulin resistance. And it really does seem to be those three fuels, especially glucose. Well, and he's not wrong. Lactate's important. Glucose, lactate, branched chain amino acids, and free fatty acids are all kind of, competing in a certain way. And yeah, then you end up with all of them elevated. And that's where the problems seem to come in. But BCAAs are one that you can actually suppress with enough insulin signaling. And so that can help you to get the glucose burning again, if that's what you want to do.
Does doing ketosis elevate lactate and make problems there? Or do you know?
I don't have an answer for that off the top of my head.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to look into it. Yeah.
I really appreciate your time, Brad. This has been a real helpful discussion and very thorough and different, answering and attempting to, explain these different concepts at a level people can grasp. And again, for folks who are curious about the meat and potatoes of your diet, which is very low in meat and potatoes right now, right? What would be your takeaway? You're doing what? 35 grams of BCAAs a day, and then the rest of you're doing another 40 or so carbs of collagen and gelatin type proteins, right? And then you're keeping your fat grams consumed at what level, and then your starches at what?
I mean, I try to, grams. I'd have to think. I try to keep it below about 20% right now of calories. So, so if you're talking about, if we said, let's say we said 3,000 calories, and it's probably more like 20% overall. So that would be 600 calories of fat. So that's about 60 grams of fat. So I would say, probably 35 grams of protein from, like you say, muscle meats and grains, another 35 from collagen, 60 grams of fat. And then carbs can be like, some days carbs are pushing up to 500 or 600 grams.
Wow. And you feel great. That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm doing better all the time. If I hadn't have had the medical emergencies in my family and all the travel, I think I'd be even further ahead, but here we go.
Well, I appreciate your time. Fireinabottle.net and Fire in a Bottle on YouTube, right? Is the best way to keep up with your work.
Yep. I'm fire_bottle on Twitter. Somewhat active on there. I try to be active, but I'm less than I should be.
What's the meat website for folks?
Firebrand Meats, low proof of pork, and check out Nourish Cooperative. We're now part of Nourish Cooperative. So go check that out. And if anyone wants to invest in a lab, hit me up.
Well, thanks, Brad. I appreciate it. It looks like things are really going strong in your research. So we'll continue to follow with great interest. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, David. We'll talk to you soon.